It should not be myopic where everything's permissioned or not permissioned. You need to have choice, but you should have consent into knowing what you're buying. So if you buy a tokenized money market fund, are you actually on the share registry of that money market fund? Or did they put a money market fund into an offshore vehicle and then in tokens, and you don't have a direct obligation for that?
Welcome everyone to the Converge podcast at the Defiant. We're today here with Dennis O'Connell. He's the president and director of the ERC-3643 Association. Great to have you here in the show.
Thank you for having me, Christopher. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Well, you're somebody who's been in the space for quite a number of years already. You come from a traditional finance background. Can you please tell me how you end up becoming the president of the ERC-3643 Association, and what other hats do you wear?
Oh, what a great question. Well, thank you very much for having me, Chris. So yeah, I come from a mechanical aerospace engineering background. I actually had the pleasure to work at NASA Langley for a few years before moving to nearly a decade-long career in derivatives trading in Chicago. I worked a couple FCMs, worked in agricultural commodities, all sorts of low latency derivatives trading. I thought that was going to be my career path. And in 2013, Andre Antonopoulos, I believe his name is, cold Chicago February night, myself and a bunch of people from DRW and Citadel, my buddies who worked there, we all went and we were just blown away about Bitcoin. And I thought, oh, wow, this is really cool. It's 2013, so nice hobby, but I'll go back to my regular day job. And from then on, I experimented with ASICs and other things. And then I consider myself like, different generations, like almost a 2017 generation. Once Ethereum kind of came out and I saw Solidity, started playing around with it and, the astronomical rise of Ethereum and smart contract languages. But I still was working in TradFi at the time. And I ultimately moved over to Merrill Lynch. I was the global architect for Delta One and Stock Loan here in New York. I had quite a big responsibility, a big budget to run a global team. And I had the privilege of actually doing my first blockchain project with R3 Corda back in the day on a stock loan use case, which was really great. And I ended up winning an award for it for Bank of America, which was really cool. And then from basically 2018 onwards, my major career was effectively dominated with blockchain projects, which seems early nowadays, but at the time I was still doing dual mandate where I had my regular work to do and I would sneak into blockchain projects here and there. And I then moved over to Bank of New York Mellon, and I worked in clearance of collateral on the 360 team with an amazing mentor, Sarthar Patnick and Vikram, who were just great mentors to me. And that was a very special team. It was a machine learning and blockchain team. And it was, 90 parts machine learning, 1 part blockchain. I ended up working over 40 different blockchain projects. I actually went back and wrote all the projects I worked on. It was Finality, Grayscale Trust, USDC, HQLAX. It was just an amazing time. And Bank of New York Mellon had so many opportunities. And as we were talking about, we had a couple of DeFi protocols, come in and talk to the bank. And one of them was Uniswap. And Hayden doesn't know this, I don't know him, but he did a presentation about Uniswap to one of my colleagues, and working in collateral at the time, I go, no, this is game changing for us, this DeFi protocol. And the next day I left for, or not next day, but the next few months I left for Securrency under Dan Doney, who was a brilliant genius mind. And I worked at Securrency for a period of time, and it gets me to my first hat, which is, Securrency was then purchased by DTCC. I worked there at DTCC. So I'm an advisor to DTCC. And the second hat along the way to your main question was, how did I get started with the association? So along the way, when Securrency was purchased by DTCC, myself and a private equity company called PSG bought one of the subsidiaries out of Securrency, and I decided to take on that business, and I had the opportunity to do that. And since then, we've grown PSG and Peregrine. We have about 50 employees globally, 5 businesses worldwide in New York, Cayman, London, Abu Dhabi, and Hong Kong. And we have about 10 billion in assets that we can tokenize across 22 clients. So we've grown quite a business. And that was always an interesting hat, being the CTO and partner of that business. And that's effectively my main day job. And so we'll talk into, challenges with that business distribution. Right. And then along the way, when I met with Luke Flampton and Danielle Cohere of Tokeny, Luke, in I believe 2022, 23, approached me about the idea of doing a nonprofit, Luxembourg nonprofit, around the standard. And I was like, I love the standard. I love what it espoused. I thought it was great. And I said, I agreed to do it. And so Luke and I, with Alvaro, who's our other director, the three of us embarked on building the standard. We had 15 founding members who were all great. And that's how we started the association. And as I started, that's where the story begins.
Right. Well, the standard has a long time in the making, and in some ways it precedes this recent, like frenzy around tokenization that everybody's, like getting on board with today. Just so everyone is on the same page, can you briefly state what the standard is about? It's called like the permission token standard. What is it? What does it do?
Yeah, it's a great question. At the end of the day, it deals around control of a token ledger. That's the species of standard that we consider it. ERC-3643 comes from a long canon of token standards. I think the most important one was in December of 2024, it reached EIP final status. So it became a full bona fide Ethereum process that was really led by Joakim and Adam and a whole team there on the technical side of token, and actually had a nickname called T-Rex, which is an acronym for Tokenized for Regulated Exchange. And now T-Rex is something whole new, which we'll get into. So the idea was, can we build something that meets the stringent requirements of the regulators? And the way I look at it is like a whole spectrum of solutions. And ERC-3643 espoused to be the technology that went the hardest institutionally, saying that we can meet all your requirements across different dimensions so that you can have the control you need around that token for whatever your context is. So we call that species permission token. Its core functionality is to create a framework around control for the token itself and the activities around it.
So the standard basically enables who? The issuer, the platform that is trading the token, the people who are building on top of it, who benefits, or both who benefits and who actually controls.
I think it's important to say that it's a self-custodial solution. It's not a custodial solution. And there are different ways to solve the same problem. And I think it's important that I say on the onset that I don't believe in myopic standards. I believe in open standards. There are different ways to solve the same problem. Standards never really solve what I call like the technical apex optimization, which is like everyone's going to have a different opinion on how to solve a particular problem. But the key thing that we've learned with ERC 21, 1155 is that this is a good enough way, a reference way to solve a problem that you then can build on top of, right? 3643 or ERC 3643 solves a problem in four critical ways. It solves it on identity, it solves it on cryptographic proofs, it solves it on dynamic compliance rules, and it solves around token control. So our friends in DeFi would not like ERC 3643 because of things like clawback, because of things that require on-chain ID. And my view is that's completely okay because it's about consent, right? The other thing you mentioned is the issuer, right? So 3643 is actually agnostic to any context. You could use it for a DAO, you could use it for an NFT, you could use it for whatever. Where it's found its home is in a new term I've been using called digital securities and permission tokens. So digital securities, permission RWAs, excuse me. So what do I mean when I say that? For example, most stablecoins are ERC-20. Why? Because they don't need that level of control.
Right.
Many times, a custodial version of an RWA or as an offshore ADR, again, does not necessarily need the heavy lifting of an ERC-3643 because in that solution, the main control location is in the custodial solution. How the transactions are done, how the tokens are minted, that sort of thing. It's in a centralized location. With ERC-3643, we are on-chain maximalist. We believe the entire kit should be on-chain fully. And in order to accomplish that, you need some kind of, big infrastructure, big pieces to do so. And that really begins with like the on-chain ID. Like everyone who interacts with it is an on-chain ID. So you could use a use case in private securities. You could use a case, we have private permission stablecoins or yielding stablecoins. We have use cases obviously in digital securities, treasuries, all that sort of stuff. But the main common thread is everything's on chain. You can use any wallet technology you want, MPC, multi-sig, hot, cold, whatever. It doesn't matter because the smart contract architecture is the main control plane around that.
So to make the parallel with traditional finance, so what I gather the standard does is that it creates additional methods and additional message fields that will allow you to know more about who's holding the token and then to exercise some type of actions from a centralized party,
Yeah.
different from the holder. So can you walk me through what this looks like in practice? Let's say I'm a bank, I'm thinking about issuing my own stable coin, for instance, or a tokenized deposit. And I'm looking, I have my open list of
Love Open
contracts,
Zeppelin. Love the guys.
contracts.
Shout out to Jonathan and Luke. I love them.
And I'm going to start deploying, and I see, okay, I have these two options. Can you walk me through the difference through it, the life cycle of
Yeah,
of
so
the
I
token?
think this is a great thing. So for the association, we have over 160 members, and we actually have 12 concurrent working groups. One of the working groups is led by Alvaro and Spain, or ISO, because there actually is not a classic parallel to what ERC-3643 does in the traditional finance.
Right.
So when you think about it, every intermediary, whether it's your exchange, custodian, depository, broker, dealer, whatever, all has a securities. They have like a database, right? The way that database tables and data is arranged and the way it's manipulated is unique. What is standardized in finance is the communication layers,
Right.
Your ISO, your SWIFT, your FIX. So blockchain, I tell people, takes 3 steps and boils it down to 1 step. In finance or in anything, it's I instruct you, you do whatever the instruction is, and then I have to check and reconcile, right? In blockchain, those 3 steps become 1 atomic step, which is I update, everyone sees. So ERC-3643 does not have any analog in the old world because the forcing function is that all of us have to share the same ledger. So we have to represent the ledger, the unit of account, in the same way. We have to agree on how that's manipulated. And that's where you get into the art versus the science. So the standard has value in the sense that it becomes a starting point or a common denominator for many of these institutions that either don't want to go with a partner and want to build their own, or want to adopt a partner or whatever, and say, okay, we know the standard, we know it has this common set framework of capabilities. Some of these members will build their own capabilities, and I'll get into that in a little bit, or build on top of it. But the core reason for these different things, just like ERC-20, what made ERC-20 brilliant is you have the same 5 functions representing a token, right? You have a token, transfer from, allow, that sort of thing, right? Then ERC-4, I think 777 came on, and people mint and burn, right? So there was an evolution to it, but the core concept was we all share the same viewpoints. So we all have to agree how these tokens are manipulated. When the regulators and a lot of these licensed institutions looked at ERC-20, they go, oh, no, not enough on-chain for us to feel good. And it really kind of took a few different paths. There was the 1400 set of implementations, which is live and well. 1400 is actually around 6 or 7 unique implementations, 1404, 1407. But they never really were finalized into an EIP standard, but they're used. And then ERC-20 permissioned, where people took effectively ERC-20 and 777 and plussed it up to have some sort of layers. Though that ERC-20 permission was considered to be a lightweight approach. So when I look at the full spectrum, ERC-3643 is on the most advanced, right? So what I mean by that? So you talk about a use case. Let's use a private asset use case just because it's easy for me to talk through, right? So first of all, whether you're the issuer of the asset, the administrator that takes care of it, any investor holding it, whatever, any actor has to have an on-chain ID, a centralized identity. One of the things I tell people about ERC-3643, that was an unintended consequence because, I remember ID 2020 and all these Evernyms and all these other decentralized identity kind of initiatives. One happy accident about ERC-3643 is we actually bootstrapped one of the largest decentralized identities, on-chain ID. It's a weird relationship in the sense that it is and it isn't a part of the standard. So everyone has an on-chain ID, and that solves the most critical problem for regulators, which is the off to on-chain connectivity, purely in a custodial list format, right? In a wallet format.
And sorry, how do I get an on-chain ID? Does it travel with me as I interface with different tokens under the same standard? And what does it tell the issuer or the platform about myself?
So all great questions. Generally speaking, you are given an on-chain ID. In this case, you have 2 sets. You have the ability to do a qualification. So am I my capacity or my organization's capacity, KYC, KYB, am I fit for purpose to actually hold this asset, right? Through that process, you then get a on-chain ID. The actual administrator of the token, 3643, will assign you an on-chain ID.
Okay.
So you'll receive one. in that pursuit.
Perfect. It's like a superior alternative to whitelists, and
Absolutely, yes.
that's the idea. Like, because today when you see things like tokenized bonds or money market funds, typically when they're issued on permissionless or like open public blockchains, a lot like whitelists, allow lists. That's the way it's done. So
right, because the main identity axiom is the wallet address.
okay.
And that's a very dangerous thing because private keys can be spoiled. Wallet addresses are user nightmare, and wallet addresses can hold other assets, right? As we recently saw what happens when you have a bunch of smart people building all these indexers, you can look at that wallet address. So it removes Ethereum unit of account, EOA, I think is the term, acronym, moves that as a primary identity into a smart contract based on-chain ID. And there's 3 immediate benefits from that. First of all, you could have multiple wallet addresses and multiple cryptographic claims. Number 2, you could wrap more advanced technologies like privacy wrapping technologies around that. And number 3, it orchestrates much more sophisticated recovery mechanisms. So we can migrate and recover tokens. So God forbid that you lose your wallet, it's not a catastrophic event. People are like, oh, well, an on-chain ID, that seems like, pain in the ass. It is, not gonna lie. But my view is you're consenting because if you want to hold this on the blockchain ledger, you need this, and ultimately you want this. There's a difference between if I lose my license, I lose my citizenship, right? This is a famous argument, right? Versus if I lose my wallet, I can go back to issuer and receive all of my claims and licenses and permissions and that sort of thing. So on-chain ID is absolutely fundamental. In fact, to the point where the token itself has an on-chain ID. Identity has always been the key thing. Another thing you mentioned is you mentioned the concept of tokenized bonds and tokenized money market funds. This is such a thing I keep talking about to people is when you look at every product, how and what is tokenized? Because you could have versions of tokenized money market funds that are non-securities, right? That don't require this heavy overhead. So people go, well, I use a tokenized bond and I have an ERC-20 permission. Why do I need ERC-3643? It's a totally valid question. The reason for that is because a lot of abstraction has been done in a centralized capacity. And I don't want to say the word diminish, but to refine and reduce the level of complexity on the compliance side so that you get a token. But there's a trade-off for all of this. And this to me has always been one of the big dangers with blockchain is the instinct of blockchain for the last 10 years was always to go offshore, do in a regulatory minimalistic capacity, right? And that has had massive benefits in liquidity, composability, efficiency, innovation, right? The ERC-20 is arguably massively successful because of that innovation around it. But the way different issuers and product providers, and there's a whole skew of them, and there should be, they've all made different concessions on what you, the end buyer, is buying. And actually, Austin Campbell had a post about this. This is something I talk about all the time, which is we should absolutely have choice in DeFi. You shouldn't have the whole thing. It should not be myopic where everything's permissioned or not permissioned. You need to have choice, but you should have consent into knowing what you're buying. So if you buy a tokenized money market fund, are you actually on the share registry of that money market fund? Or did they put a money market fund into an offshore vehicle and then in tokens, and you don't have a direct obligation for that?
And going back to this idea of this issuer who's now thinking about, a regulated entity, they're already somewhat uncomfortable, getting into the stable coin route or whatever. So how do we sell this to the compliance team within the organization? What will that allow them to do? And what sort of new risks does it create? So for example, one of the things that you can typically do in traditional finance is, starting with not accepting an incoming SWIFT transaction.
That's right.
So I will not deal with, Russian, banks and institutions or persons on the OFAC list. They will just not be a thing because I'll block them before they get within my perimeter. Then I have the ability to reverse a transaction, which is, one of the things that people really enjoy.
Yes.
And then typically things like the equivalent of travel rules or KYC, etc., are done, like off-chain.
It's a lot. Yeah.
How does the standard make my life easier in those sense before we get to, the end user?
Yeah, so many good things in there. First of all, I would say the idea of a unwarranted transaction is not a bug, but a feature of blockchain, right? The ability to unilaterally push a transaction either at a coin level or an ERC-20 level, right? Because there's no control mechanism on that, you can't stop it. Now, you can blacklist a label. I know some of the MPC providers actually have a solution, or they call them gray wallets, if you're familiar with that term. But my view isn't to solve it with more off-chain tech. My view is to solve it with on-chain tech. If you want to enter into a framework, a paradigm where you don't get unsolicited transactions, or you want more control, you have to consent to giving to a trade-off of giving up more than when you join DeFi, right? So in DeFi, the ability to be fully intermediary, on demand, I could redeem whatever my tokens wherever I want. You forfeit the ability to have a clawback, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in ERC-3643, the 4 pillars that I go back to is, we talked about on-chain ID, right? This ability where you have smart contract base, where you have cryptographic claims and you have multiple wallets assigned. Everyone, whether it's the administrators, the operators, the investors, whoever interacts with the token standard in that capacity. Sorry. The second thing is the identity registry. The identity registry effectively holds a library of claims that get very granular into what level of KYC are you, and how do we verify that in a cryptographic sense.
Yeah.
So whether it's you're KYC'd in a specific country, or you have a politically exposed person, or you're accredited or qualified investor, that level of granularity is able to be done, and able to be done in your choice of whether on-chain, off-chain, claim and proof. The other great thing about 3643, which is a trade-off, is that it's actually not one smart contract. It's a complex of smart contracts. So on-chain ID is its own smart contract. The identity registry is a set of smart contracts, about 4 smart contracts. And then you have the compliance modules, which can be anywhere from 1 to many smart contracts. Now, a compliance module solves two different problems. People go, well, what's the difference? Identity registry gets you into Disney World. Compliance module tells you whether you're high enough to ride the ride.
Right.
So there are two. So the registry concerns itself with the participants and their permissions. The compliance concerns itself with the contractual obligations of the asset, or whether or not you're acting within that. Now, the big problem that rises up with compliance is complexity of the rule set and freshness of the data. And one of our best integrations is with ACE from Chainlink, a compliance engine, which solves both of those use cases. And so we see all types of compliance modules, whether it's number of transactions, particular country codes. Now, I think we'll get into transaction a little bit, so I'll go granular there. But the 4th pillar is the control of the token itself. The token has over 120 controls around it. It's fundamentally an ERC-20 that's been wrapped. And what that means is you have all the things you expect. You could pause the whole thing. You could freeze an individual account. You could freeze individual tokens if you want. You could perform the clawback. You can perform migration. The art of this is mapping those capabilities to things like corporate actions. So for example, you go up to your accredited investor and you're like, hey, I want to own this asset and I want to take it in tokenized form. You go to an administrator, you go through a qualification process, you pass that process, you're given an on-chain ID. Then you go back, you go through a subscription process. You may send stablecoin, fiat, whatever. And in that transaction, you're then minted to your wallet in your on-chain ID. You're then minted your tokens that you have in ERC-3643. And you just look at them, and then you're able to transact with them, but only to other qualified and registered investors. And we'll get into why that's a challenge and a big challenge in a little bit. So now you can rest easy that if your tokens are transferred incorrectly or you lose sight of them, the administrator never lose line of sight of the tokens. And so clawback frustrates a lot of protocols, because if an administrator is able to come in and gut out all or 50% without the other consent, you break composability, right? Like you can't go with ERC-20s and go into Aave and clawback stuff out. But with 3643 and 1400 other permission token standards like 7943, which is the newer ones, you absolutely can. That's a key tenet. So that's a key piece of frustration. So that's what I talk about. It's a compromise of consent, which is, if you don't want to be in a paradigm where you don't get unsolicited tokens, or you don't want to lose line of sight, or something happens, the trade-off there is that for someone to have administrative control. Now, it's not centralized in the sense that it's off-chain. It's fully on-chain control, and it's modularized.
Right.
So,
So you basically know what you're getting into ex ante versus what we see today. So let's talk about the alternatives today. So, and one alternative when you have things like the DAO exploit would be, hey, let's go and say Circle, like, come do something, block this wallet address, make this transaction good for the people who have been, robbed of their assets.
Yeah.
But they have limited tool set and they have to react exposed, right? So basically it's asking the question whether you want to intervene or not. My sense is that the standard introduces a way that you can prevent those things from happening in the first place because you sort of like define the type of actors that...
Correct. And if you saw with the DAO, eventually clawback and eventually legals now become an issue. Like the original like panacea of DeFi, which was a strong believer, is that what happens in blockchain stays in blockchain. And if you remember, the biggest concern at the time was the ETH fork, right? And that was a huge thing. But that was like the first loosely termed clawback or undo, let's call it, right? And those are done under the most exigent circumstances, right? It's a very serious thing because it comes into all sorts of things of like governance and decentralization and that sort of thing. The challenge is, and again, it's not specific to ERC-3643. It's, any solution, 3643 is the heaviest of these solutions.
Right.
And then they come down and become more lightweight, where ERC-20 permits is the most lightweight. But the main thing is you have to trade off in terms of your unilateral control over that token, right? So if you don't like what happened with Kelp DAO, the reason why they were able to exploit it with the bridge and everything, with layer 0, was because there was no governance mechanism to the extent that they needed it to either pause the bridging in time or claw back the tokens. Like they lose line of sight, and then they were able to just shred them and send them all over the place. ERC-3643, we've never had those issues. Now, there is a distinction between what can be done at a smart contract layer and then what can be done on a protocol layer, right? And this was to your earlier question. There's a limitation of ERC-3643 and any other token standard at the application layer because it is subservient to what can be done at the protocol layer. Now, in the purpose of Kelp DAO, that was a clawback at the protocol layer, right? Which was an extremely big deal for them to do so. Clawback nonetheless to correct it and recover the funds, which I believe was correct, but not without controversy, right? So that's a challenge for DeFi. And again, I don't believe in myopic solution. There's different degradations of it, but you should know what you're getting into. Like if you're buying real world assets, which are non-cryptos, not all RWAs, like we talked about, either have the same rights or privileges as what existed in the original world. That's one layer of consent. And not all of them are tokenized the same way. Right? Some of them are tokenized with ERC-20 permissions. Some of them are tokenized with 1400. Some of them are with ERC-3643. You have to know what you're getting into and what capabilities that issuer has or administrators have around that token so that you're aware of what can and cannot happen. It's not good or bad, it just is, right? And so you could have the same treasury bond where you can use ERC-3643. Like, you want the actual treasuries? There you go. You get a full KYC, the whole shebang. You own the actual treasuries, good for you. And then you have different degradations where like, well, your treasury's in SPV and you're just getting tokens of it in your ERC-20. Okay, well, if I'm in a DeFi protocol and I'm getting yield on treasuries and I feel good, I'm like, oh, tokenized treasuries. Haha, stupid 3643 guys, I didn't need half of that.
Right.
Yes, we are stupid in the sense that it's overly complex, but we're not stupid in the sense that when things go wrong, you wish you had that level of protection. Because once things go wrong in another layer, you may not have the same level of protection. It's not no protection, but not the same level. So it's all a trade-off in that capacity. And I think that's where it's gotten much more complicated for people. When you go on X, you're bombarded with tokenized stocks, RWAs, and all this narrative. It's like, whoa, what is all this? Like, why isn't everything using ERC-3643? And the reason is they're not all the same. So they don't have the same solution. And I think it's very important.
If I'm thinking, going back to this project, this institution launching tokenized security, whatever it is, and I'm thinking about the tech stack that I need to assemble. Okay, you sold me on the idea of adopting the standard for this token that I'm issuing.
Yeah.
What else do I need and what might be missing? You already mentioned privacy, for example. A lot of these permission like chains, one of the key benefits that you have privacy. Nobody wants to see, their trades being out in transparent for everyone to see. So if you're building your ideal stack, what are you layering on top of the standard? What might be missing as well?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we're very blessed at the association to be a living and breathing standard. So first big area of focus, everyone is looking at on-chain ID.
Yeah.
Either wrapping in privacy, enhancing it, integrating some much more sophisticated identity frameworks. So we're seeing a big push on that. And number two, Oracle data. ERC-3643 is a very data hungry token standard. In general are very data hungry. So we're seeing a lot of integrations and projects with different Oracle providers writ large. large. And that also includes both non-privacy and privacy wrap solutions. Another big thing is like corporate actions, right? So you have a stock split or you have a dividend payment. We're seeing when we reimagine ERC-3643 in different languages, every time we've done that, the corporate actions are handled slightly differently,
Right.
whether as a convenience function, orchestration function, or whatever. So you always have your same primitives, but to the degree of which the convenience of, okay, rather than doing like, a mint for everybody, I could do like a batch mint. I have like a special like dividend that includes batch mint and a bunch of other things in there. So we see a lot of playing around with that. And then the next big thing is actually registration. It's in the sense of like EINs, QSIPs, ISINs. How do you tie the asset to that pricing? That's a big area of improvement that we're also seeing. So it's living and breathing. And then of course we have our two major projects that have launched at ETHCC that we announced, which was the T-Rex Ledger and Ascend, which I'll get into. And so one solves the composability issue, which you raised, and the other solves the fragmented liquidity.
And that's a good segue to talk about adoption. Where is it at the moment? I've read about announcements coming live, in the next couple of years.
Yeah.
So what's the TVL under the standard and what's going on?
Yeah, so this has been a very frustrating thing for me as president. It's about credibility. I see a lot of these great dashboards. Adam at the RWA XYZ team is fabulous. The Doom team has been fabulous. We just did our survey or census for 2026 of ERC-3643. And that was spurred because we had over 111 billion announced in April, which is an extremely high number. 100 billion with Apex coming by 2027 at least. And with Bridge Tower and that team doing the DOMX token on Avalanche with 11 billion. For many years when we started the work and the standard, the majority of the assets were the tokeny clients, which were around 28 to 30 billion. Yeah. We always had a challenge with the way tokeny and the relationship was to disclose those assets. There was a nice project in 2025 last year with Qualitics, I think I'm saying their name right, that did the Dune dashboard that actually shows a bunch of projects. So what I can say is it's very difficult because a lot of really great projects do not want to be disclosed, which is very frustrating for all of us because either there's an NDA in reason, there's privacy reasons, they don't want to disclose the value. What I can say that I've personally verified is now with Bridge Tower Public and the assets that I do know on chain across 28 different blockchains. We're just around 80 billion in assets on chain right now, which is incredibly insane number. The problem is a lot of them are latent. They're just sitting there, TVL, not much composability.
And what are those? Are like tokenized liquid assets, for instance, or?
It's incredible how the diversity. They could be Dubai real estate. They could be Swiss bonds. They could be mineral and mining rights in Africa and Europe and North America, like DOMX is in North America. They could be hydrogen sustainability, like with PSG, Digital, my company, do a lot of sustainable. They could be, structured products and CLOs and private equity and aviation leasing, and they could be anything around Skybridge, right, and the fund of funds. It is truly diverse, and we're seeing a lot more money market funds. We weren't even involved, but BNP Paribas chose the standard for their money market fund product, and then we also announced with World Liberty Fi with Apex with their permission stablecoin for World Liberty Fi. So it's literally anything and everything you can imagine that's out there. The pipeline, which is always optimistic. So from what we know with our internal numbers, we'll probably, if we're lucky, be around over 150, probably 200 billion by this time next year. The total pipeline, when I asked for the survey, I said, what is the maximum size of this asset if you were to fully bring on chain, which is always an optimistic number. So I want to caveat that to the audience. But to give you the idea, the firepower behind this, it was 7.9 trillion, which is a crazy number to come across all these different assets. So it's like, we tokenize this percentage in initial offering. We'll see if we get more of a bite, we can go up to this number. So that's what that number. So that number will always be optimistic. I'm hoping that we get maybe 20% of that number in the next few years. But if you're hearing me, you're getting the natural hockey stick of these sort of assets that are coming writ large.
And considering clarity and bringing more clarity to the space,
Yeah.
but in some
Yeah.
ways replicating some of the structure, the centralized structures that we're used to.
Yeah.
What's your take, and so like to wrap up on what you expect to see in the next 6 and 12 months, and how the industry will change, and will it be more towards permission but open standards versus closed ecosystems?
It's going to be two worlds collide. So the way I look at it is us in ERC-3643, we're part of the RWA tribe. We're a subsect in the RWA tribe. I mostly calls us digital securities, mostly from, being named in the innovation exemption with the SEC, being named by Chairman Atkins, which I'm extremely grateful for. Chairman Michael Seelig of CFTC has been very good to the standard. And, some of our members, including them in their various SEC actions, has been really, really positive for us. That kind of credibility that we have has feedback to the rest of the world, where we were always strong in Europe, strong in the UAE and the GCC, Middle East, and very strong in Asia in terms of different adoptions. So the frequency and conversation I'm having is very much increasing on that, which is a great thing. But for all the victories, I say, for all the victory that ERC-3643 has had in terms of regulatory wins, institutional adoption, TVL, the challenge has always been the why. Why do you put this? Why do you go to the extent that you do to put this asset on chain? To what end is it? And where DeFi, they went a different route, where they went to this minimalist regulatory approach for a whole bunch of very good reasons, some positive, some negative. And they were able to maximize liquidity, composability.
Right.
You could do so many things with ERC-20. But if you look at the DeFi numbers, it's sort of plateaued. It kind of spins. Things like, pump fund and meme
musical
coins.
chairs.
Yeah, you have what I consider to be a weak asset class basis, to put it lightly, right? Highly volatile, highly correlated to Bitcoin, that sort of deal. It's like really challenges, and then you add in like kind of the criminal element, the fraud element, really challenges DeFi to grow, because fundamentally where they've excelled with liquidity, the trade-off of not dealing with RWA has been that the crypto tokens as a whole have suffered. I think that's safe to say. So the two worlds actually need each other, and everyone knows this now. People didn't know this 9 months ago, but we could see it because when you're facing clients and investors, and like, well, tokenization sounds great, but why? Like what am I getting? It comes down to word of utility, right? And underneath utility is incentive, liquidity. And so with the association and our members, we launched two major projects to deal with this problem. We launched T-Rex Network, which is backed by the Apex and Tokeny teams. And then we launched Ascend, which is backed by the PSG Digital team. They're sister projects, and they solve two aspects. Ascend is the world's first on-chain tri-party vault that we're building. It enables us to collateralize ERC-3643 and any other permission assets. We take the same heritage of ERC-3643 around identity, registry, compliance, and control, and put it into a tri-party model where the borrowers and lenders do not directly interact, versus most of vaults like 4626, where they do. And there's a whole reasons why we do that. The net effect of that is that by going through all the hardship with the actual bona fide share registry and asset on chain, really difficult for secondary trading, very, very cumbersome, because, I think we want to go through this, which was what happens in a transaction, right? So ERC-3643 transaction is quite complicated. When you do a transfer in an ERC-20 transaction, several checks have to be made. Are you in good standing? Am I in good standing? In other words, are accounts frozen? Do you have enough for the transfer, as you would expect? What claims do you need, and are they valid? What claims do I need, and are they valid? So we have to go back to identity registry, turn on-chain IDs, and do our cryptographic checks. Then we have to go through the compliance module and go through, which rule did we pass? This rule, oh, we failed. Okay, revert. Pass, whatever, how many rules? Again, that's complex. Then we actually do the transaction, and then we do another look back on the compliance module post the transaction, within the code block, to say, okay, we moved the funds or moved the tokens. Is everything still good, right? And look back, yes, everything's still good. And then the events are admitted. So that's a very gas intensive sort of thing. You cannot do it with Uniswap. It's completely untenable. Right. A lot of people in the vault space who are brilliant were like, well, you're ERC-20 based, like we could just integrate you. Functionally, you can, but you run into a bunch of problems. You run into contamination, I call it. Whereas if we're now a digital security, a US registered security that we represent, and we put you into a DeFi protocol and you are not a broker dealer,
right?
Big problems, right? Number two, regulatory. If I pledge and you have direct interaction between the borrower and the lender, and the lender gets half of their tokens clawed back, the borrower is completely naked with no recourse, whatever. And worse yet, if when there is a liquidation, the liquidator is then saddled with a collateral that they then cannot deal with, right? So Ascend solves that issue, but it also enables holders of these assets who've gone through that terrible process of qualifying and everything, because the benefit is ownership. But the also benefit is that on chain, I could see the actual asset. So in other solutions where you have a custodial solution, the actual assets are in custody somewhere and the tokens are minted. So where they minimized the regulatory to maximize liquidity, the actual token itself is a very weak basis. So what I've said is, okay, when we look at RWAs, assets that have light level of permissioning are great for trading because they're very fungible. You don't need a lot of transactions and they may have some light touches around them. And again, there's a spectrum of this. So you go up a step, right? On our side, where we can do trading, but it's very cumbersome. But where we're really great is collateral, because when you look in the vault for Ascend, boom, there you see the actual same that you would on a share registry. And those tokens are really not meant to move, but when they do move, it's consequential.
So great for commercial paper or tokenizing.
Repo, all the big stuff.
Mortgages.
Yep.
Securitizing.
We could do repo and MBS, absolutely. And yeah, so Ascend is US based. It was encouraged by the new environment in the US. And it was meant to solve the key problem, which is, for all the hard work we've done with these permission tokens, ERC-3643, the net great benefit is a collateral basis. Now, given the pedigree we have with the regulators, we felt we were in a unique position to be one of the first DeFi protocols to go for a full FINRA regulation, which we've already achieved, which I'm very happy about for Ascend. So we view Ascend as being two things: an on-ramp for DeFi to come onshore to the US, and a source of high quality liquidity yield for DeFi borrowers and lenders. And most importantly, a way to emit tokens that are fully on-chain collateralized into DeFi for composability. So now if I go to an investor who says, well, I own this private credit asset, it's liquid, it's in good standing, what's the net benefit? Well, you have now two benefits. One, you could get liquidity from it on a line of credit without forfeiting your asset. Always great, you can buy more. And more importantly, if you don't want just liquidity, you want to bridge into DeFi and get like an enhanced yield or put in a swap, you can now do so. And we at Ascend, the facility, will deal with the liquidations through our reserve model. And we've had really massive adoption impact of this. And for Ascend already, we've had about 130 billion in assets pledged to the platform. So what does that mean? Are we going to launch 130 billion? No.
Yeah.
What it means is the problem of liquidity is so severe for permission assets that people are very willing to try many solutions, right? Number two, the idea of being onshore, very difficult. We're one of the few teams that can do it, but the idea of collateral liquidity is going to be the way forward for this. Now, I fully anticipate a lot of like the RWA vaults being able to come online, but again, distinguish the different ways of doing it. You can have RWA vaults and you'll see more of them coming, but look into what's actually being pledged and collateralized. There will be a difference. And then T-Rex Network, which is launched by Joachim Lepron, who's one of the technical authors of ERC-3643, solves the fragmented liquidity problem. It's a reference chain. It's optimistic and Polygon layer stack. They've had massive backing from several large institutions upfront, which is really great to see. And it's meant for a reference chain for liquidity fragmentation across the 28 different chains that we operate. There's going to be a whole app store around that concept and building what is becoming more and more two new terms that I use: institutional DeFi and on-chain finance. Now, the reason why I make a distinguish between those two terms, which are new for me, is I view institutional DeFi as DeFi, but both sides are KYC, right? Both sides are on that side, but still DeFi. On-chain finance to me is like repo, where you're taking a project where they don't really care about composability, but they're doing something that's on a collateral basis, and they're doing it either in a walled garden, this is like almost like your Cantons of the world, and they're doing repo or Connexus even, and they're doing repo but using a blockchain technology and on-chain finance. So I've been evolving those terms. I and the team at Ascend, we personally believe in permissionless DeFi. We believe there should be a full spectrum of this. And what we want to do is unify the two worlds of saying, hey, listen, all this great stuff that we've been able to do in RWA land that is intimidating for you guys in DeFi, we've solved that for you.
Mhm.
Let's integrate and let's enjoy the best
Yeah.
of both worlds and reunify.
Well, no, fantastic. Really exciting to see those two sides and those two projects, gaining more traction and getting to see those institutions becoming DeFi native in a sense and
Yeah.
getting more finance on chain. Really a great conversation. It's been a pleasure having you here on the show. So I really appreciate it and hope to have you again really soon.
Thank you, Christopher. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much.